I thought the massive shapes behind my woodshed were just trees that had fallen after the worst blizzard in decades. But as I drew closer and saw that they were breathing, I knew the world had changed forever. 3 enormous creatures lay collapsed in the snow. What happened next would test everything I believed about fear, compassion, and the hidden world that exists just beyond our sight. I live alone in a cabin high in the mountains, miles from the nearest neighbor. At 65, I've chosen to separate myself from the noise and chaos of towns. My days follow the same rhythm year after year, checking my traps, tending my small garden in summer, and preparing for the brutal winters that can stretch for 6 months. The cabin is simple but solid, built by my own hands 30 years ago when I first walked away from civilization. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that look out over endless forest. The nearest road is a rough dirt track that becomes impassable in winter. When the snow begins to fall, I'm cut off from the world until spring. I like it that way. The mountains have given me a peace I never found among people. The silence is complete, broken only by wind in the trees and the occasional call of an eagle overhead. I've learned to read the weather, to sense storms days before they arrive. My supplies are always stocked. Firewood is cut and stacked. Survival has become second nature. But this particular winter was brutal, even by mountain standards. Storm after storm rolled through, each worse than the last. Snow piled higher than my windows, and the cold cut through everything. I've endured many hard winters, but this one tested even my experience. The blizzard struck on a Tuesday morning with a fury that shook the walls of my cabin. For 3 straight days, the wind howled like a living thing, trying to rip the roof away. Snow fell so thick I couldn't see past my front porch. Temperatures dropped lower than anything I'd seen in decades. Inside, I kept the fire burning non-stop and rationed my food carefully, knowing the storm might last longer than expected. The wind roared so loud I could hardly hear my own thoughts. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the fire. This was survival in its rawest form. On the 3rd night, something changed. The wind began to ease, and the constant battering of snow against the windows softened. By morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world buried beneath several feet of fresh powder. The silence was absolute. Not even the usual sounds of the forest broke it. Everything lay smothered under the weight of snow. I knew I had to check the damage and clear paths before the next storm came. Mountain weather is unpredictable, and another blizzard could roll in at any time. I pulled on my heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around my face, and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a physical blow. My boots sank deep into the snow with every step. The world looked completely transformed, turned into an alien landscape of white drifts and ice-coated trees. Behind my cabin sat the small woodshed where I store my split logs. The building was nearly buried under the snow that had drifted against it during the storm. As I circled the cabin to inspect for damage, I noticed 3 massive dark shapes lying in the snow behind the shed. At first glance, they looked like fallen trees. The storm had been strong enough to bring down even the largest pines. But as I moved closer, something felt wrong. The shapes were too even, too deliberate. Fallen trees would scatter randomly, but these 3 forms lay close together, almost as if arranged. I grabbed a shovel and began clearing snow from the first shape. What I uncovered made me stagger back in shock. It wasn't a tree at all. It was a body enormous, covered in thick, dark fur and faintly breathing. The second shape revealed another body, smaller than the first but still far larger than any human. The third was clearly the smallest of the group, though even it dwarfed a man. All 3 were unconscious, their shallow breaths barely visible. Ice crusted their fur, and the exposed patches of skin beneath were tinged blue-white with severe hypothermia. I stood in the snow, staring at what I had found. My mind struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. These were the beings of legend, the creatures people swore they had glimpsed in blurry photographs and shaky video. And now, 3 of them lay at my feet, broken by the storm. But here they were, real and dying in my backyard. Fear hit me first. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, to grab my rifle and put distance between myself and these creatures. The stories of violent encounters flooded my mind. These beings were supposed to be dangerous, unpredictable, capable of great violence. Yet as I looked closer, Fear began to mix with something else. These creatures weren't threatening anyone. They were helpless, dying in the snow. The largest, clearly the male, had positioned his body to shield the other two from the worst of the wind. Even unconscious, he had tried to protect them. I realized what had happened. The family had been caught in the storm, likely searching for shelter. They had made it as far as my property before collapsing from exhaustion and cold. If I did nothing, all three would be dead within hours. The female's eyes were half open, just a crack. She looked straight at me with an expression I will never forget. There was no aggression in her gaze, no threat, only desperation. She was pleading with me, asking for help in the only way she could. Then her eyes closed again, and her breathing grew weaker. I stood in the snow, faced with the most important decision of my life. I could walk away and let nature take its course. No one would ever know. Or I could do something that went against every rational thought in my mind. I made my choice. Moving the creatures into my cabin was the hardest physical task I've ever done. The smallest, what I assumed was their child, was manageable, though it still required all my strength. I wrapped it in a tarp, rigged a crude sled with rope, and dragged it through the snow and inside my door. The two adults were an entirely different challenge. Each weighed several hundred pounds of dead weight. With a mix of ropes, boards, and sheer determination, I managed to haul them inside, one at a time. The effort consumed most of the day and left me utterly spent. My small cabin was transformed. 3 massive bodies now occupied nearly every inch of floor space. I could hardly move around them. The fire that usually kept me comfortable now seemed pitifully inadequate against the task of warming so much mass. I worked methodically, stripping away the ice-caked fur with towels, drying them as best I could. The skin beneath was cold as stone, pale with lack of circulation. I wrapped them in every blanket I owned, every spare scrap of cloth I could find. My entire stock of bedding barely covered their huge frames. The fire became my obsession. I fed it constantly, building it higher than was safe or comfortable. The cabin grew stiflingly hot, yet still the creatures showed no sign of warming. Their breathing remained shallow and uneven. I began to fear I had acted too late. I didn't sleep that first night. I sat by the fire, watching my strange patience, adding wood whenever the flames began to fade. Every hour or so I checked their breathing, felt for a pulse in their massive wrists, trying to judge whether they were improving or slipping away. Around midnight, the youngest stirred. Its eyes opened, darting around in confusion before locking onto me. There was no fear in its gaze, only curiosity. It made a soft sound, almost like a question. I spoke gently, telling it everything was all right, though I doubted it could understand. The child stayed awake for about an hour, watching me tend the fire and check on the adults. It seemed fascinated by the flames, the way they danced and shifted colors. Eventually, its eyes closed again, but its breathing was deeper now, more steady. By dawn, all three showed signs of improvement. Their skin had warmed to the touch, and the dangerous blue tint was fading. I allowed myself a moment of relief. They would live. But as the sun rose, new questions filled my mind. What would happen when they recovered fully? Would they be grateful or angry? Would they see me as a savior or a threat? I had saved their lives, but now I had to live with the consequences. The female was the first to regain full consciousness. I was adding wood to the fire when I heard movement behind me. Turning, I saw her sitting up, staring straight at me with intelligent eyes, but without any trace of confusion or fear. For a long moment, we studied each other in silence. I kept my movements slow and non-threatening. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to understand something. Then she looked around the cabin, taking in the blankets, covering her family, the warmth of the fire, the evidence of care. She reached out with a massive hand and gently touched the blanket draped over the child. Her fingers, surprisingly delicate for their size, brushed the fabric with unmistakable tenderness. Then she looked back at me and made a deep sound in her throat. It was not threatening. It sounded almost like gratitude. The male woke gradually, emerging from unconsciousness in stages. First, his breathing shifted, then his fingers twitched. When his eyes finally opened, they immediately sought out his family, checking to make sure they were safe. Only after confirming their condition did he turn his attention to me. Unlike the female, his gaze was more cautious. His eyes narrowed as he assessed the strange situation. I could almost see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to make sense of how they had ended up in a human dwelling, wrapped in human blankets, warmed by a human fire. Yet there was no aggression in his posture. He remained still, watching, thinking. I had the impression I was dealing with a highly intelligent being, carefully weighing the implications of their situation. The child recovered quickly once it was fully awake. It moved around my cabin with open curiosity, examining everything with wide eyes. It touched the walls, sniffed at the furniture, and watched the fire with delight. I was struck by how human its expressions were. The family stayed close together, never straying far from one another's side. They communicated through a series of low sounds and subtle gestures that I began to recognize as a complex language. I couldn't understand the words, but I could read the emotions behind them. Feeding them became my next challenge. My winter supplies, carefully rationed for one, now had to stretch much further. I cooked larger portions of everything. I had dried meat, canned vegetables, bread, and soup. They ate gratefully but with restraint, as if they understood my supplies were limited. The female seemed to grasp the situation best. She stopped the male and the child from taking too much, making sure I kept a fair share for myself. It was clear she understood they were guests who shouldn't burden their host. What impressed me most was their intelligence. These weren't primitive beasts driven only by instinct. They were thinking, feeling beings, with complex social bonds and emotions. The way they cared for one another, the way they respected my space, while showing gratitude for my help, it all pointed to a level of awareness I had never expected. Days passed, and the family made no move to leave. I began to understand they were waiting for the weather to improve, perhaps, or for the child to fully regain its strength. In the meantime, a strange new rhythm developed inside my small cabin. The family helped maintain the fire, carrying in wood from my pile outside with ease that amazed me. What took me many trips, the male could do in one. They seemed to understand the importance of keeping warm, contributing without being asked. The female showed me things I had never noticed before, subtle changes in the wind that signaled a shift in weather still hours away. She demonstrated how to weave pine needles into tight bundles that burned longer and hotter than ordinary firewood. Her knowledge of the forest was vast and precise. The male proved equally knowledgeable. He showed me tracks outside the cabin that revealed the presence of animals I never knew lived in the area. He demonstrated how to read the bark of trees to tell which direction storms usually came from. His understanding of the mountain environment was encyclopedic. I realized I was learning more about wilderness survival in a few days than I had in 30 years of mountain living. These creatures didn't just live in the forest, they were part of it in a way humans had long forgotten how to be. Trust grew slowly but steadily. The family no longer watched my every move with caution. The child began to approach me directly, even allowing me to examine a small cut on his hand that needed attention. The female started making eye contact whenever she wanted to show me something important. By the fourth day, the weather cleared enough for the family to venture outside. I watched from my window as they moved through the deep snow with an effortless grace. What was backbreaking work for me seemed easy for them. The female returned carrying something in her hands, a hidden cache of preserved food she had found in the hollow of a tree not far from my cabin. I had walked past that tree hundreds of times without ever noticing the careful storage space inside. She shared the food with me, making it clear that these were emergency supplies to be used sparingly. The preserved meat was unlike anything I had ever tasted, rich, flavorful, and clearly prepared with techniques I didn't recognize. The dried fruit was perfectly kept despite the harsh weather. The male showed me other things during their brief excursions. Tracks in the snow revealed the passage of other families like theirs. Markings on trees seemed to carry messages, signs pointing to an entire hidden community living in these mountains, running a life parallel to ours, occasionally intersecting with it. I began to understand that my cabin sat in the middle of a territory inhabited for generations. These creatures held detailed knowledge of every stream, every cave, every shelter for miles around. They knew which plants were edible, which could heal, and which to avoid. They had been watching me for years. I realized they knew my habits, my routines. They may have observed me building my cabin, learning to survive in what was, in truth, their territory. The fact that they had come to my property during the storm was no accident. They knew I lived there and that I might help them. On the seventh day, I heard something that chilled me to the bone, the distant sound of snowmobile engines echoing through the forest, growing closer by the minute. I knew instantly what it meant. Search and rescue teams were looking for me after the severe storms. The family's reaction was immediate and intense. All three tensed, moving quickly to the windows to peer outside. The male made urgent sounds to the others, and for the first time since they had awakened, I saw fear in their eyes. They knew as well as I did what discovery would mean. At best, it would expose their secret existence to the world. At worst, it could bring hunters, scientific expeditions, and the destruction of their hidden way of life. The trust they had built with one man could not be extended to humanity as a whole. The snowmobiles were closing in. I could tell they would reach my cabin within minutes. I looked at the family, saw the desperation in their faces, and realized I had to make another impossible choice. Everything in my cabin bore evidence of their presence: extra food containers, blankets scattered, the oversized fire that had burned non-stop. Even if the family hid, the signs of their stay would be obvious to anyone looking closely. Without hesitation, I began erasing every trace of my guests. I shoved extra dishes into the cupboard, folded blankets as quickly as I could, and scattered ash to make the fire look normal. The family understood instantly what I was doing and joined in, moving urgently, efficiently. The male went to a corner of the cabin where he had been quietly working throughout their stay. I had noticed him handling pieces of wood but hadn't understood what he was doing. Now he returned with 3 perfectly carved wooden figures, representations of each member of his family. The carvings were astonishingly detailed, not only capturing their physical forms but somehow their very essence. The figure of the male radiated strength and protection. The females showed wisdom and grace. The child's embodied curiosity and playfulness. It was artwork crafted with a level of skill and refinement I could barely comprehend. The male placed the figures carefully on the mantel above my fireplace. Then he made a sound I understood more clearly than words. A thank you, deeper than language could ever carry. The gift was not just wood and carving. It was a vow that they would never forget what I had done for them. The snowmobiles were almost at my door now. The family moved to the back entrance, ready to vanish into the forest. The female paused, looking back at me one last time. She placed her hand over her heart, then pointed toward me. The message was unmistakable. I would always be in their hearts. The child lingered, reluctant to leave. It came close, gently touched my hand with its own far larger one. I felt the warmth and strength in that touch, the trust and affection of a young being who had learned that not all humans were to be feared. Then they were gone, disappearing into the woods with a speed and silence impossible for creatures their size. I closed the back door and returned to the front room, just as the first snowmobile pulled up outside my cabin. The rescue team found me sitting calmly by the fire, reading a book, as if nothing unusual had happened. They marveled at how well I had weathered the brutal storms. My cabin was warm, my supplies in order, and I appeared healthy and in good spirits. I told them I had gotten through the storms without trouble, that I was used to being snowed in for long stretches. I thanked them for checking on me, but insisted there was no need for evacuation. The mountains were my home, and I intended to stay where I belonged. The team leader seemed impressed by my self-reliance and positive outlook. We shared a little hot coffee and talked about the unusually severe weather. I nodded and agreed it had been quite a storm, but nothing I couldn't handle. After an hour, the rescue crew prepared to leave. They offered once more to take me back to town, but I politely declined. As they started their engines and headed back down the mountain, I watched from my window until they disappeared from sight. Only then did I allow myself to exhale, relieved. I had protected the family's secret. No one would ever know about my extraordinary guests or the week that had forever changed my understanding of what this world shares with humanity. Life returned to normal after the family's departure, but everything felt different. The cabin seemed larger and emptier than it had ever been before. The silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed empty. I found myself listening for sounds that would never return, yet they had left me more than memories. Near my back door, I discovered a small bundle of medicinal plants I had never seen before, roots and leaves, with clear healing properties. Enough preserved food had been hidden in various spots around my property to last me the rest of the winter, carefully placed where only I would find them. My knowledge of the forest expanded dramatically. I could now read weather signs days in advance, track animals I had never noticed before, and locate food sources I once overlooked. The knowledge they had shared made me a far better survivor than I had ever been alone. Most importantly, I no longer felt truly alone on the mountain. At times, I would come across subtle signs that they were still nearby. A carefully arranged pile of stones, tracks appearing overnight in fresh snow, or the unmistakable sense of being watched by friendly eyes. They were watching over me, ensuring I was safe. I never tried to reach out to them again. The gift we had shared was too precious to risk by pushing for more. 1 week together had been enough, a perfect moment of trust and compassion between species that were never meant to meet. In the months and years that followed, I came to realize I was living under a kind of protection. When heavy storms struck, I sometimes found my woodpile mysteriously replenished. When I fell ill with a fever one winter, healing plants appeared outside my door. When predators came too close to my cabin, they were quietly driven away. I gained a reputation among the few who knew me as unusually lucky and skilled in the mountains. Hunters and hikers who crossed my path were often astonished by my knowledge of the forest, my ability to predict the weather, and my understanding of animal behavior. I never explained how I had gained such expertise. The carved figures remained on my mantle, my most treasured possessions. Sometimes in the glow of the fire at night, they seemed almost alive, as if the spirits of my friends were still with me in some way. I would speak to them, sharing my thoughts and the stories of my days with the only beings who might truly understand. I grew old gracefully in my mountain home. My body slowed, but my mind stayed sharp. The wilderness continued to provide for me, and I continued to guard its secrets. I had become something in between man and wilderness, a guardian of mysteries the world was not yet ready to know. As I aged, I began to write down my experiences, but never in a way that would expose my friends. Instead, I carefully compiled notes on mountain survival, weather prediction, and forest knowledge, all the practical lessons they had taught me. I kept the true source of my wisdom to myself. I lived longer than most men do in isolation, strong and healthy well into my 80s. The mountain environment that would have broken many seemed to sustain me. I had found a way to live in harmony with the natural world, and it rewarded me with long life and peace. When I finally passed away quietly in my sleep one winter night, I was found in the spring by a relative who came looking for me. My cabin was tidy and orderly, as though I had prepared for my departure. The carved figures stood prominently on display, and my journals were left where they could easily be found. My family member was astonished by the detailed survival knowledge recorded in my journals. I had become an expert in mountain life, with insights that seemed to come from decades of close observation. The journals were eventually shared with wilderness experts, who praised the practical wisdom within them. But the true story remained hidden. In the final entry, written only days before my death, I had written, "3 strangers taught me that the world is far more wondrous and mysterious than we imagine. Some gifts are too precious to share, and some friendships too sacred to expose. I kept their trust, and they kept mine." The carved figures were inherited by my relative, displayed in their home without ever knowing the truth of their meaning. To them, they were simply beautiful works of art, crafted by an unknown hand. They became a family heirloom, passed down through generations. My reputation as a skilled mountaineer lived on. My survival techniques were studied and shared among outdoor enthusiasts. My ability to predict weather and understand forest ecology became legendary among the few who had known me. But my most important legacy was invisible. Somewhere in the mountains, a family of beings continued their hidden life, protected by the silence of a man who chose compassion over fear, trust over betrayal. They carried with them the memory of my kindness, and perhaps told their children about the human who saved them from the storm. I had proven that the distance between species could be bridged, that understanding was possible, even across the vast differences that seemed to separate all living things. My week with the hidden family had changed not only my own life, but had created a moment of connection that would echo through time. In the end, it was never about proving such creatures existed, or convincing anyone else of what I had experienced. It was about the simple truth that compassion knows no boundaries, that help freely given forges bonds that can never be broken, and that some of the most important moments in life happen far from the eyes of the world. The mountains keep their secrets, as they always have. But now those secrets include a story of friendship, of trust, and of the possibility that we are never as alone in this world as we think we are. Somewhere in the forest, watchful eyes still linger guarding what is hidden and those who keep the silence.